the Zoom client didn't want to start, so
I see.
we'll have to deal with this. I hope that's okay.
Not a problem. Sometimes there are technical issues. All right, are you ready to go ahead and get started?
Sure. And what they say is AI is easy. AV is difficult, right?
No doubt about that. All right, so I'll start with a introduction of you. So, Dr. Ramsøy, am I saying that properly?
You can say Ramsøy. It's actually
Ramsey.
a Scottish name that was made into Norwegian for some reason. So
I see.
it's a mess.
I see. Okay, very interesting. All right, Dr. Ramsøy is a professor of neuromarketing, one of the pioneers in the fields of consumer neuroscience and neuromarketing, and also the CEO of Neuroscience Inc., one of the premier, dare I say, pretty confident about that, one of the premier neuromarketing agencies in the world. And he teaches one of the only neuromarketing courses online or offline on Coursera, and also an excellent advanced neuromarketing course on his website, neuronzinc.com. I'll include a link to that in the show notes. Dr. Ramsøy, do you think that covers it pretty well?
Absolutely. I thank you for that introduction. That's great.
All right, great. So here's a question I have for you. So you studied neuroscience in school and academically. Out of all the fields you could have gone into in neuroscience, why neuromarketing?
That's a good question. No, I think that so I actually started way before this. I started at the business school in Norway first. I started doing business economics, and that was where I started. And I realized that I didn't want to do kind of financial analysis. That was way too boring. But I liked the organizational psychology, and I liked the marketing. And so I went into psychology first. And I graduated with a master's in psychology, and I worked many years as a neuropsychologist. Within kind of clinical neuropsychology. And when I got the chance, I always did research. From the day before I graduated until I started my PhD program, I always did research, and that kind of helped me into getting a PhD in neurobiology, and at the Danish Researcher for MR. So that was kind of MR research, fMRI, structural MRI, and trying to understand decision making and emotional responses, for example. So that was kind of the path I took in studying anything from emotions to memory to consciousness to decision making. And then at the end, when I was finalizing my PhD, I was invited over to the Copenhagen Business School to establish a kind of a research collaboration between the business school, the university hospital, and then also the technological university in Denmark. So to as a multidisciplinary approach to understand decision making. Yes. So that was kind of the way it all started, and it's kind of my approach to try to understand how we make decisions, but always being interested in not kind of lab-based, almost like rat studies or monkey studies, but actually to understand how humans make decisions. And, since humans are living in modern societies, it doesn't really help just studying people as they lie inside a kind of a big noisy scanner. So I try to move a bit beyond that. But as it turned out, I think that I was, at the time that I was growing a little bit frustrated with the academic publish and perish race. At the same time, I was contacted by Lowe's, the home improvement company in the US, to basically help them build a neuroscience toolbox. So that was basically kind of the startup, from making that transition of still doing academic research, but also doing a lot of applied research and trying to understand both how people make decisions, but also how can we measure and predict decisions, and how can we improve how people are responding to things in everyday situations.
I see. Very cool. I had a somewhat similar path, though not as cool. When I was in undergrad, I guess I kind of had one of those right time types of things, because by the time I got to undergrad, things like behavioral economics and neuroeconomics started to become popular. So I was taking a class on neuroeconomics at my university, and one day I was like, wait a minute, this applies to some of the skills I already have, because I had known how to make websites, but I was like, oh, I can probably make a lot better websites that reach their goals and the goals of my users more effectively, because I understand decision making at a better level. So it seems to be, because I also study business, and I was like, wait a minute, I'm getting kind of bored of this in the accounting. I have like insomnia, but I'd fall asleep studying accounting. So we're very similar in that regard. So
yeah, it's a kind of a thankful topic, right? Both understanding the human mind and the human brain, and at the same time, you can actually it's applicable. If you're a pragmatist, you can actually do something that, it can actually change people's behaviors, right? And
Yes.
I think that was what drove me into kind of this more commercial approach as well.
I see. Very cool. Now, so then you started applying neuroscience to marketing and developing neuroscience toolboxes. What would you say, perhaps in short, what would you say neuroscience can do for marketing today?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So on the one side, you have neuroscience can definitely help in building better models, a better understanding of how we make decisions. So, marketing is this kind of combination of psychology and economic thinking. So that was kind of infusing psychology into economic thinking was kind of the upstart of modern marketing, if you like. But psychology has moved on. Psychology has integrated neuroscience as part of its apparatus and theoretical approach as well. So that means that if you really want to do marketing, consumer insights, trying to understand people, and this goes beyond that as well. It actually goes into management, leadership, innovation work, for example, as well. If you try to understand how people make decisions, then neuroscience should definitely be on your, as part of your toolbox, your theoretical toolbox. But it should also be part of your toolbox for measuring people as well. So that's kind of the second thing that neuroscience allows and neuromarketing allows you to do, is to have, instead of just only kind of theories, you can have measurement devices as well that tell you, are people actually looking at what you want them to? Do they understand the whatever you're telling them, and does your message resonate with them? Are they engaged, for example, or are they disengaged? So that and the thing is that instead of just doing this as a questionnaire that you do typically, you have to do that at the end. It's very difficult to poke people and say, what do you think now? What do you think now? But you can have, by using neuroscience tools, you can see how it unfolds second by second, right? So I think that and by using that, eventually you can both diagnose, but you can also create much better predictive models as well. So theory, measurement, and diagnosis, and then also prediction. I think those are kind of the three most important things that you can see the added value of.
I see. Very cool. Good summary. What would you say neuromarketing can't do? Perhaps the limits of neuromarketing.
It can't read people's thoughts. That's plain and simple. I think that a lot of people are trying to oversell and underdeliver, to be honest. Especially the message that there's the idea that we could just strap on this device and we can just read everyone's thoughts. That is not that simple. So what we can do is we can measure certain things, such as your emotional engagement, your cognitive loads, how much information you're keeping, what you are attending, for example. But we can see, from that brain activity, whether you're thinking about A, B, or C, for example. So that's one thing. The second is also that currently there are certain technical limitations and technological and scientific limitations in terms of what you can do with some of these scientific tools. Unfortunately, neuromarketing, because of the popularity of neuroscience, has undergone and is still undergoing, I would say, a certain level of hype. So there's a couple of kind of hype cycles going on, where there's a lot of overpromising and under-delivering. And I think that one of the things I always kind of pick on a little bit is this idea of remote facial coding, automated facial coding, where the idea is that you can measure people to what extent they smile or they're showing different kinds of expressions. I'm still on the fence about how reliable those measures are. I would love if they were just, pick and choose and just use them, because they would have potentially some added value. But I still think that that is one potential tool. There are other types of tools that are just they're not. The science is not there yet, to be honest, to be fully kind of scaled to the extent that we're currently seeing. So I would always be a little bit concerned about some of the solutions out there, just because it's so easy to sell, right?
Of course it is. I see. Very cool. Thank you for that. So what would you say, I think there might be a bit of echo, let me move the mic away further. Let's talk about some of the models of neuromarketing. I'm taking your advanced neuromarketing course right now. So let's talk about the 4 powers model. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, this was a work that, is not particularly new in itself to have these kind of 4 different powers of how advertising works. But this was based on work by Professor Babar Shiv at Stanford University that, he did a lot of, he's done a lot of, theoretical work, also a scientific test with fMRI and EEG, and come up with a good kind of coherent kind of step-by-step theory, if you like.
Yes.
And what we were supposed to do was to, as part of a larger project for a big media house in Scandinavia that is called Bonnier Media House. So this is one of the bigger media houses in Northern Europe. And they were interested in understanding how can we measure and how can we diagnose ads, but also how can we predict the success of different ads based on these neuro measures, but also do we have a theoretical framework to put that up against? And then finally, can we use this knowledge to understand which platform is best to use? Is it social media versus print versus what kinds of do you need to adjust your ad to the platform, which should be obvious, but how should you do it, right? So so what we did was to basically use, together with Professor Shiv, we used the model, and then we came up with a set of different tools that are use eye tracking and EEG, different types of measures, to come up with very kind of strict measures for each of those powers. And we had, so it's a 4-power model, as you say. It's stopping power, which is attention. To what extent does an ad stop people's attention and maintain people's attention? The second is then persuasion power, which is to what extent something is emotionally engaging. So does it resonate with the audience? The third is the transmission power, whether people understand the message you give them. Do they actually understand what you're trying to tell them? And then finally, you have locking power, which is all about does it actually manifest as a memory later on? So that was something we came up with measures for. Stopping power was eye tracking. We had EEG, kind of brain measurements for the persuasion power, the emotional response, and then transmission power, which is a kind of cognitive response. And then for locking power, we actually used a 2-week follow-up memory test on people. And we did this for 3 rounds. And we had something like a few hundred people per round that actually went in to do EEG and eye tracking and were followed up later on as well. And what we were able to do, among other things, was to use these kind of eye tracking EEG scores to create a score that predicted subsequent memory for the ad, which was pretty cool.
I see, very cool. Now, in your work, have you found any ways to increase either the 4 models for an audience? Like, let's say you wanted to increase stopping power or locking power. Have you found any ways to do that in your work?
Definitely. And I think that there are some easy wins and some really kind of low-hanging fruits on this. We have done this a gazillion times where we, just by showing, you do A/B testing or ABC testing, and you definitely just show that A is performing decently, but B is just abysmal. It just doesn't get the attention that you intended, or when people are looking at it, they're not paying attention to the brand or anything like that. And then C is really doing something right because people are looking at the brand or whatever you want them to see. So the first thing is that just doing the testing alone gives you a lot of insights. But then there are also some general insights you get across tons of tests. A good example is that we've seen again and again that when you present something in the bottom right corner, that is something that by other researchers also have been called the corner of death. And then, if you put anything down there, it will be a maximum of 4% of your audience will actually pay attention to whatever you show it. And lo and behold, when you do a kind of a broad survey of different visual ad material, almost 50% of all ads are positioning their brand in the bottom right corner. So that means that, the old saying of, Wanamaker that said, half of my marketing budget is wasted. I just don't know which half of it. Well, at least we know that 50% of your ads are probably doing worse than they need to, because they're just positioning the ad in the wrong place. So that's one thing. The other thing would be, using other tools such as, kind of early vetting tool. So we have invented something called Neurovision, which is an AI-based model that is based on the eye tracking data we have, and it is over 90% accurate in predicting what people actually will look at when we compare it to eye tracking. And that means that, and it gives you then, of course, you upload a picture or a video, but if you upload a picture, it takes something like 10 seconds to get a heat map back with some other scores as well. And it tells you, people are most likely to look here, 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 but they're not going to look here. And that is an early vetting tool, because it means that you can now just try out different versions, and you can try out 100 different versions, and then you find which ones that actually perform the best on the scores that you would like to have. So there definitely are tools becoming available now that were not available just a few years ago. Other things that we've seen is that if you look at social media, advertising on social media, in general, people have a higher cognitive load. So that means that they have their bandwidth is much more filled up with information when they're on social media, because it's just a rush of information going on at any one time. And that also means that the likelihood that people will spend time and understand a complex message on social media is much lower than if you are presenting the same message in a slow-paced website or in paper format, for example, as is a newspaper. So that shows that you need to adjust your communication depending on the format, the platform you're on, basically. So that was very much kind of advertising, but we've tested a lot of things, such as, when Google were inventing their AR solution, the Google Tango, the augmented reality solution, or when IKEA was launching electricity as a service. This is something you can also do and use neuroscience tools to basically understand how do people respond in a way that they are not able to communicate, for example. So it doesn't, it's not isolated to ad testing, it's also to completely new services and products, for example. So yeah, as I said initially, when you want to understand human behavior and what drives people, then you can use this approach.
I see. Very cool. Very good summary. Thank you again. So let's talk about the toolbox. We'll talk about some of the physical tools. So let's start with EEG. Can you give maybe like a 1 to 2 minute summary of the pros and cons of using an EEG for neuromarketing?
Sure. EEG is by far the oldest technology that we've used, and it's had its renaissance for the past 20 years, I would say, but it's I think it's more than 100 years old at this point. So that means that it is the use of electrodes positioned typically at the scalp. You can do it intracranially as well as part of a surgery or surgical planning, but it's typically you use that to measure the electrical output from the brain. So the brain is what we call neurochemical. So that means that it's both, or electrochemical, so that it's both electrical and magnetic outputs you can measure on, but it's also chemical and other types of things you can measure on. But with the EEG, you're only measuring on these kind of electrical fluctuations that happen. What you then do by, have like X amount of electrodes on the scalp, you are then extracting those signals. You're translating them into what we call frequency bands. So it's almost like tuning into different frequencies on the radio, and then you can tune into different types of frequencies. So typically what we see is that slow frequencies are when the brain is basically relaxing or in deep sleep, and have very high, kind of highly aggressive frequencies is when the brain is really working hard, so to speak. And when you try to look at that, the combination of position of the electrodes, but then also what type of frequencies you're looking at, you can correlate that very nicely with different types of responses, such as emotional responses and cognitive responses. So that's kind of the short version. It is a pretty kind of sophisticated way to use, and it's not plug and play by no means. So you need to have a good neuroscientist aboard, probably a statistician aboard as well, to do a proper analysis. But once you do that, once you have people trained aboard that do this, then it's pretty straightforward, so to speak.
I see. Very good explanation. What about GSR, the galvanic skin response devices? Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, so you can, just as you take electrodes on the scalp, you're basically measuring, putting 2 electrodes typically on 2 different fingers on the same hand. What you then do, instead of measuring the output from the muscles, for example, you're actually measuring the conductivity between the 2 points. So if you put a current, a mild current between the 2 points, you can say that a very dry skin, it has high resistance. It doesn't really transmit the electricity very well. But if you are sweating a little bit, or you have otherwise moisturized your skin, then the level of conductivity is much higher. And what we see is that when you sweat in the palm of your hands, or that is a very good indication that you have a slightly emotional arousal response. And by that means, when you're measuring on the GSR, you can tap into that, the arousal response in people. The problem with that is that the GSR is a pretty noisy signal and it's a very sluggish and slow signal. So the analysis of it is not as precise as you would often like to.
I see. When would you think would be a good time to use a GSR, if ever?
GSR is very mobile, so that would be kind of the first case. If you really want kind of a simple setup, and you really want to just try it out and see how it, how people respond, that would be the easiest time to do it. The EEG is also mobile now, but it does require, as I said before, much more kind of sophisticated analysis. I wouldn't say that GSR would ever be plug and play either. It depends on which vendor you're using, but typically you'll have to do some kind of statistical analysis of it. So yes. In general, GSR would be for just easier, smaller setups for typically kind of mobile setups, I would say. But it's also when you don't have to know whether it's a positive or negative emotional response, because it only responds to whether it's a high or low emotion, so to speak, not whether it's positive or negative.
I see. Thanks for that. Okay, and what about eye tracking? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, eye tracking has really kind of undergone a lot of, almost like a revolution. It's a silent revolution these days, I think. But you see today that the devices, instead of strapping people into these kind of hard boxes that to track people's eyes, you can now even webcam eye tracking is becoming reasonably good. I wouldn't say it's fully scalable yet. But if you use some of the accessible tools, I know Tobii is the big player here. They have more than 50% of the market, and they have released some very kind of I wouldn't say cheap, but are still more affordable solutions that allow you to measure with infrared cameras where the eyes are, and the frequency of those measurements is typically like something like 20 milliseconds per data point. So that means that you can start quantifying both where people are looking, you can quantify how long they are looking at something, you can take their scan path, and you can also measure, depending on the device, you can even measure pupil dilation, which is actually very correlated with the arousal response you measure with GSR as well. So if you do, and I have papers both recently published, but also in review as well, where we are looking at pupil dilation in different types of consumer settings as well. So this, you can even measure emotional responses with pupil dilation.
I see. Very cool. All right. I've got about 5 to 6 minutes left. Dr. Ramsøy, is there anything else you think people should know about neuromarketing?
Yeah, I think that maybe what we see now is that maybe neuromarketing is outliving its own name, to be honest. I think that if you think about neuromarketing, it seems to be very limited to market research or marketing use per se. And I think that what we see today is that we can go in most different types of situations that are either consumer related or way beyond. So that means that I wouldn't normally just say that it's marketing. I think that what we see today is that we see that it's being used in completely new environments that we hadn't thought. 10 years ago we wouldn't have thought that this was possible. But we see now that with technology becoming much smaller, cheaper, more available, more scalable, we see the science becoming more robust, and there's an alignment in the industry and academically as well that we need to create more robust and better metrics as well. I think that what we can expect to see in the coming years is that neuromarketing tools will become much more like the thing that measures your attention when you're driving your car, for example, or when they're falling asleep. That is actually probably more related to what we can expect to see in the coming years, rather than just being this kind of high-end research tool. So yeah, I think that at least is some of the things to think about.
I see. Very good. So we covered a lot in a very short amount of time. So that's just a sign of your expertise. So thank you for that. So where would you say people can learn more about neuromarketing? You can talk about some of your materials, of course.
Sure. I mean, of course, I do see that my old Coursera course is still making the rounds. I think that well over 100,000 people have taken it at this point, which is great. I mean, I'm not involved in that course anymore. I did recordings, but it's a lot of years ago. We have the new course through Neuroscience, the Neuroscience Academy. So we have one course now, and we're adding more courses as we go. If you're into reading, I basically wrote the textbook on this. So that means that the Introduction to Neuromarketing and Consumer Neuroscience is available. I would say that I would rather wait for the second edition, because the first
when
edition
is that coming out? I'm
was
waiting on that one. When's that coming out?
we're currently putting our last hands on it now. It's coming out through Oxford University Press. So that means that it's probably end of this year, I hope. The first edition was actually just made for the purpose of my students, and for some reason people started buying it, which was never intended. So it's not really copy edited or anything. So it's a mess, to be honest. So I'm trying to kind of change that with the second edition. And then also I have a new book coming out now. Initially, first in Danish. But now I more or less in parallel, I wrote it in English as well. So it's coming out hopefully at the end of this year as well, as tentatively called The Consumer Brain. And then it's more like a popular pop science approach, so to speak, and especially to the 4-part model that we talked about here today. So that will be hopefully that's something I can send you as a token as well.
Okay, great. Very cool. Let's see. All right, so I think that covers it pretty well. So if you are interested in learning more about Dr. Ramsøy, you can connect with him on LinkedIn. He also has a website at neuronsinc.com, correct? And also your personal website, it's, what is it again?
That's thomasramsøy.com.
Let's see, can you repeat that one more time? I think I lost your audio.
That's thomasramsøy.com.
Okay, thomasramsøy.com. All right, Dr. R, anything else you'd like our audience to know?
No, it's awesome. Thank you for the great questions. I appreciate it.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you for the great answers. And this is great, really informative for me. I think a lot of people will find this greatly informative. And again, thank you. And I will hopefully talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.